Hi, I'm Wojciech Wiasta. I'm the spokesperson of the RCI Action Committee, and today we're joined by Abhishek Mathur. He is the co-founder of the Masala, Mehndi, Masti Festival. It's a pleasure to see you, Abhishek.
It's an absolute pleasure to see you after so many years. And
I know, and this is the weird thing. We've always done radio interviews, and here we are seeing each other, and it's for the first time, because we never met in person. We always met over the phone. And so this is great. I think I want to start off just by asking you to tell the people who are watching us, what was this festival? It's like on hibernation right now, but for years and years, every year we would be talking about it, also with your co-founder wife, about the festival. So tell us what the Masala Mehndi Masti Festival was about.
Sure. I was an immigrant to Canada in 1990. And I think the biggest culture shock I had coming from South Asia to Canada was the South Asian community and how insular we were and how divided we were in terms of different, I guess, micro ethnicities. And to me, that was very strange on religious grounds or regional grounds. We tend to keep to our own. So there was hardly any chance of us integrating into the larger Canadian fabric if we were so committed to our own little cliques. And that to me was a big issue as someone who was a new Canadian and who wanted to be, proudly Canadian in every sense of the word. And my wife, although she was born and raised in Canada, also South Asian, felt the same way, and we just felt we had to do something about it. And so it was born out of, we'd actually produced another event, which was for the Indian community, realizing that, why are we shouldn't be calling ourselves Indian. We're Canadian first. We have a descent from a particular part of the world that ties us in culturally and socially in a certain sense, but we have so much to offer the Canadian fabric that we really need to present ourselves on a mainstream platform downtown Toronto in a format that is recognizable to the vast majority, and not just in a community hall or in a suburban location. So a multicultural festival within a multicultural sort of society was founded, which spoke to multiple generations, spoke to different linguistic groups and cultural and religious groups without being political and without being religious. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it was to fill this gap that we felt wasn't there, that we felt was there, that wasn't allowing the South Asian community to really get integrated with Canadians in general.
And the festival had everything. It had music, it had readings. It was like a cultural festival with a South Asian accent to it.
Yeah, so it was a multidisciplinary festival with music, film, dance, theater, visual arts, food, culinary arts. Like it was very immersive. And the key curational, I guess, principles were that it should be South Asian in terms of content, or it can be non-South Asian content, but presented by South Asian Canadians or South Asians from anywhere in the world, or non-South Asians who had either been inspired by South Asian culture. So there was a thread that we tried to tie, which didn't mean that it had to be just South Asian cultural content. But at that time, we talked a lot about fusion and experimentation, different types of art forms between cultures, between genres of art, and an intermixing of audiences. So we tried to cross-pollinate audiences by way of programming also. So for example, on the main stage on a Saturday night, we would have had the first act would have been extremely classical in nature, for example. And the second act would have been a British South Asian hip hop act. So we'd hope that those who'd come to see the classical act would stay the extra 15 minutes between the transition of shows and watch the hip hop style act, and therefore generate an interest in different styles of artistic disciplines. And it really worked. It was a huge success. Our first year, we had 25,000 people, and then we were hitting 100,000 on an annual basis, approximately.
And you've had a very high profile because you were supported by a lot of corporate sponsors and that. So that in Toronto. Now, I wonder, in terms of the last times we were doing interviews, it was for my weekly program, Masala Canada. And
Yes.
when I started looking back, I realized that even for other programs that were aimed for India or for South Asia, we were doing interviews with you or Jyoti about the festival. You were always very willing to do an interview with me. Why?
Because I think who you were targeting and who you were reaching out to was important for not just us as a South Asian community, but for Canada. And I say that because there is a perception outside of Canada of who makes up being Canadian. And it's an unfair perception. It's a perception that is years in the making. But there's a real Canada that most people don't really know. And I think shows like yours, in particular, allowed us to be featured and showcased to those who didn't know, and opened their eyes to what being Canadian and living in Canada was all about. And it is such an... Sorry.
Go on. No, go on.
No, and I was saying it was... I think it was... There's always, for potential immigrants or for people who want to just visit the country, Canada is like a beacon, right? Everybody wants to come to Canada. But
and that kind of segues into the question that I have for you is, what was the difference between being interviewed by Radio Canada International, by, let's say, a South Asian media outlet, and our public broadcaster, the CBC?
Great question. And I think even when we do our promotion planning, and we try to make sure we got into the eyes and ears of these three different categories. So you had your ethnic community media vehicles or journalists and ethnic, I guess, newspapers and radio stations within Toronto that really was speaking to the resident community, the South Asian community that looked to them for news and entertainment from our culture. And then you had the mainstream broadcasters and the mainstream media, which would speak to Canada across the country. So again, within the country. But who was it that was going to tell our story to people outside the country? And yes, there are people who do tune into some Canadian. And we're talking about quite a few years ago. But that trend, I mean, it still continues. Let's face it, CBC is not BBC, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. So where do we get international news? Where do international viewers or listeners get news about Canada? That is not also international news, but is news about Canadians and what's happening within the country.
So for you, you think it's very important for people, let's say back in India, or for people, who listen to our other language services, for people in the home country to get an understanding of Canada.
Yeah,
and the reality
absolutely.
here.
Yes, and I think that would help, because if there's more interaction, then because of that, if there's, let's say our festival, through your show, reached out to artists who were listening to the show, or potential investors who wanted to come to Canada, and through your show, they saw what the Canadian cultural fabric was all about in reality. There could be a greater impetus to have, artists want to come and either collaborate with other artists over here. When I say here, I mean Canada, or other investors who want to come in and invest in other cultural industries, for example. And I'm only talking about cultural industries because that's the space that we were in. But I mean, these could be business stories. These could be stories about, different realms of education, universities and high schools and whatever. But by telling such stories to pockets of communities around the world, because they have that cultural thread or that link with immigrants in Canada, I think could only benefit Canada in so many ways. Otherwise, we're just hearing what the rest of the world is hearing about international news. And honestly, Canada's a blip on everyone's radar when it comes to Canadian news, unless it's Trudeau's, hairstyle of the day. But, which most people over here follow and love.
Yeah. But because that's one of the problems that we're having sometimes explaining to people when they talk about the fact that, well, the CBC and Radio-Canada, well, they have things that are accessible around the world on the internet. And so that should be enough. And I think that's what you've just underlined. The importance is that when you do programming specifically aimed at people outside of the country, where you have to explain certain terms, even as simply as the Prairie City of Regina or the Prairie City of Winnipeg, so that people have a chance to understand what we're talking about. And I think the same thing happened when I was talking with people within the South Asian community here. We would be discussing things such as racism in Canada, and we could talk about the actual fact of what is it like to be brown in Canada. That it's not easy.
Yeah. And we did these conversations at MMM, at Masala, Mehndi, Masti.
Yeah.
The LGBT community, racism, sexism, the status of women, uncomfortable topics that elderly or senior South Asians who came to the festival, balked at, that we were actually discussing these out in the open. And with a radio station like yours and your shows, if you were able to do the same to a much wider audience, I think the dialogue that would be developed and created by something like that across borders, across continents, would be so much more meaningful.
And it also allows for people, whether they come here as tourists or potentially as immigrants, or whether they're doing business with Canada, it helps them understand the reality of Canada. And I think we were fairly honest in the way we described things like racism, like the reality here that it's not, the streets are not paved with gold. There are problems. And at the same time, as any Canadian, and even I hear that when you're talking about things, we're all proud of the Canadian reality, but we also recognize that it's not perfect.
Absolutely, as is nowhere, and it needs to be worked on. We need to keep trying.
You are one of the signatories of our open letter that we sent to the Prime Minister, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Foreign Affairs Minister, and the Canadian Heritage Minister. And I thank you for signing it, because we're calling for the government to put a stop to the changes and the new policy at RCI, and to take a moment to reflect, to let the staff of RCI get together with a group of qualified people outside of the CBC Radio-Canada to come up with a form of editorial and financial autonomy, and the possibility of figuring out how there can be a strong future for RCI. And I'm wondering if you could tell us why you signed.
And for all the reasons we mentioned before, but I think it's important that we have a voice that is heard not just by Canadians in Canada. And I living overseas at the moment, I can tell you, forget Canadians over here. We're a big Canadian community, in the UAE. Very few people will tune into Canadian news. It's just the likes of us who want to know what's going on back home. So I read the Star or the Globe and Mail online, or I listen in to shows. But there are so many people who are fascinated by Canada and just want to know more and want to know the ground reality. I mean, people who are trying to emigrate. They want to hear the grassroots stories. They want to hear what's going on the ground, not just what's happening in Parliament, and not what's happening in the oil industry in Calgary, but really, what are our lives like? And who better to tell those stories than people like you for us? So that's why I signed.
Well, and we really appreciate it. And this is honestly, this has been such a pleasure to be able to see you while I interview you. And Abhishek Mathur, thank you so much.
Oh, I have goosebumps talking to you after so many years, but visually, which is fantastic. Just
Abhishek
fantastic.
Mathur is the co-founder of Masala, Mehndi, Masti, a wonderful festival that was held every year in Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and God bless. I hope this happens.